Margaret.
Good evening. I believe we're live now. Good evening and welcome to our continued celebration of Hispanic Heritage Month. My name is Margaret Connors-Aquaid and I have the privilege of being the acting director of the Hispanic Society. Our program this evening is titled From the Iberian Peninsula to Antwerp to the Antwerp Salon, Leonora Duarte and the Business of Music, presented by Dr. Elizabeth Weinfield. Elizabeth Weinfield is no stranger to the Hispanic Society, and many of you may recall the extraordinary concerts that she has performed with the Hispanic Society together with the Sonnambula over the past several years. In addition to being an exceptional musician, Dr. Weinfield is also a music historian. Her research explores the relationships among gender, performance, and race in the early modern period. Dr. Weinfield is a native New Yorker. She holds a PhD in historical musicology from the Graduate Center at CUNY, a master's in music from Oxford, and a BA in art history from Rutgers. She teaches music history at the Juilliard School in New York City and is the founder and artistic director of the ensemble Sonnambula. Dr. Weinfield has designed site-specific concerts at the Metropolitan Museum, the Cloisters, the Hispanic Society, and the Frick, and recently published the first complete recording of music from the 17th century composer Leonora Duarte. She's also published on old instruments and historical performances, and she is working on her first book on Leonora Duarte, Converso, Composers in Antwerp, a monograph on Duarte that investigates music's role in the convergence of business and culture in the early modern domestic space. I'm really delighted that Dr. Weinfield will bring to life the work by women composers and focus in particular on the 17th century composer Leonora Duarte, who was a Portuguese-Jewish converso living and working in Antwerp and the only known woman to write for the viola, the gamba, in the 17th century. This evening is live, so you are invited to ask questions through the chat on YouTube. I also encourage you to visit our website and take advantage of our programs and recordings that are also available. If you are not a member of the Hispanic Society, I strongly encourage you to become a member. It's because of your support that we're able to offer these really wonderful, rich programs. So with that, I thank you all for joining us this evening, and I welcome Dr. Elizabeth Weinfield. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much, Margaret. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all this evening. Thank you to the Hispanic Society, to the board, and I'm so delighted that we have this medium in which to share ideas and to talk. And as Margaret said, I hope you'll stay on at the end of the talk so that you can ask me any questions that you may have. So some of you know me as the director of Sonnambula, which is an ensemble that performs music from the early modern world. So let's say around the 16th centuries through the 18th centuries. Now, our music, as many of you who attend our concerts know, is centered on the instrument known as the viola da gamba, or the viol, which is a 6 or sometimes 7-string fretted instrument related to the guitar that's played with a bow, and it's held da gamba, or on the leg. What is striking about the viol is that it originated in Spain. It then traveled to Italy, to the Low Countries, to England, and eventually to Germany and to France, where it was the courtly and then later the domestic instrument of choice amongst the cultured elite for really the good part of 3 centuries, before falling into relative obscurity in the 19th century with the advent of the piano and the modern orchestra and these large halls which sort of demanded more sound and so forth. So all of the music that we play, no matter the country or the origin or the circumstance in which it was written, has this very special, we can say, material connection to Spanish culture. That said, Today, I'll be talking about two particular composers with ties to the Iberian Peninsula. The Spanish-Viennese classical composer, Mariana Martinez, 1744 through 1812, who was writing in the second half of the 18th century, so at the time of Haydn and Mozart, and just as the viola da gamba starts to fall out of favor. And I'll also discuss Leonora Duarte, who is a composer still very much entrenched in the capabilities of the instrument and who was composing in the middle of the 17th century, following the Judeo-Spanish exodus and Judeo-Portuguese exodus into Northern Europe. So we'll begin with Mariana Martinez. Now, Martinez was born in Vienna. Her father, Niccolo Martinez, was the Spanish envoy to the Esterhazy court, a role that ultimately landed the family in that city. And those of you that know Vienna well today can probably appreciate how much this city really bears its imprint of the past. The walls that once encircled the city are down today, but the ring that they left are traced by wide boulevards that pulse with traffic and trams. Many of the grand houses and the palaces are still there, even though they're used mostly today as cultural institutions and as museums. And most of the streets in the center of the town still follow their old courses. These are paths that knew the footsteps of Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms, Bruckner, Mahler, and Schubert. And within this pantheon of great voices of classical music, Martinez's story is especially poignant for its singularity and also for its exceptionality. The family lived on the Michaelerplatz in the center of the city in a stately building, not this one, alas, whose residents, true to 18th century fashion, were situated in accordance with social class. So wealthier residents on the bottom floors, poorer up on top, and so on. So for example, on the bottom floors were some minor Esterhazy princesses, and in the other extreme, in the top drafty attic rooms, lived a young Joseph Haydn, who was then a struggling musician. The Martinezes lived in the middle floors, in rooms that adjoined those of the composer Niccolo Porpora and the court poet Metastasio, who is the great librettist to Caldera, to Hasse, Handel, and Porpora, and of course later to Mozart. It was Metastasio who discovered, in fact, the young Martinez's talents after hearing her play the harpsichord as a child, one imagines through the walls of their building. And he suggested that she take some lessons from Porpora. And through Porpora, then Martinez eventually met Haydn, who accompanied her earliest music lessons and would eventually teach her much more seriously himself. Martinez writes about her mentors, which is very striking. In an autobiographical letter that we have dated 1773, which she wrote as a 30-year-old woman, she writes, quote, "I was born in the year 1744 on the 4th day of May. In my 7th year, they began to introduce me to the study of music, for which they believed me inclined by nature. Its rudiments were taught me by Signor Giuseppe Haydn, now Maestro di Capella to Prince Esterhazy." So Haydn has, of course, gone a long way since his days in those garret rooms. But in all of my studies, the chief planner and director was always and still is Signor Metastasio, who, with the paternal care he takes of me and all of my numerous family, renders an exemplary return for the incorruptible friendship and tireless support which my good father lent him up until the very last days of his life. Metastasio was equally impressed with the young Martinez, and he was fascinated with her compositional processes and saw to it that she knew the music of the important composers. In fact, his own letters draw attention to the rich store of music that Martinez apparently never tired of augmenting, and occasionally give us wonderful anecdotes, such as she regularly played and wrote with a copy of Pergolese's Stabat Mater beside her on her harpsichord desk. Metastasio would bequeath to her, in addition to a hefty sum of money that would ensure a lifetime's independence, the sum and the parts of his own substantial music library. Now, at this point, Viennese Musical Society knew the grown Martinez as a gifted aristocratic singer and as a virtuoso keyboardist who had performed for the Empress Maria Theresa. And there is indeed a certain vocality and lyricism, even to her instrumental music, as we'll hear in a moment. Martinez held a regular salon with her sister, which attracted the creme de la creme of Viennese musical society, including Mozart, who not only was a frequent guest to the salon, but composed four-hand sonatas to perform with Martinez there. However, unlike many saloniers in her day, Martinez, we think, widely disseminated her music in manuscript. And this is a crucial point in the history of women in print culture and of women in intellectual history. Already in the 1760s, for example, Queen Maria Carolina of Naples, one of Maria Theresa's daughters, was singing Martinez's arias. We have this documented from testimony. And she was likely singing from a manuscript that she purchased in Vienna when she was there to marry King Ferdinand in 1768. And as you can see here in this portrait, she's holding a printed image of her father. So whether by print networks or by word of mouth, though probably by both, Martinez's reputation extended well beyond the walls of Vienna as well. The English diarist and the critic Charles Burney wrote the following on his travels. He writes, quote, "I went to Metastasio for the last time. I found with him much company, and the Saint Cecilia herself, Martinez, at the harpsichord, to which she had just been singing. She had been so kind as to have transcribed for me a song of Metastasio set by herself, with which I had been greatly struck in a former visit." So let's now listen to an example of Martinez's music. This is her overture in C major. It's sometimes called a sinfonia because there are a few different sections to it, much like sort of a short symphony. It was written in 1770, and we'll hear the first movement. And this recording, this video recording, is from a concert that we performed in 2018 during our Hispanic Women Composers series with the Hispanic Society. And it was recorded live at St. Ignatius of Antioch Church in New York City's Upper West Side. And for those music geeks out there, we're playing from a modern edition, but it's worth noting that the autograph manuscript of this work, and indeed much of Martinez's oeuvre, is in the Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde in Vienna. Now, I know that many of you watching this today were at that concert, and so it's a pleasure to relive that with you here. It also makes me somewhat nostalgic for performing, certainly at the Hispanic Society and elsewhere. So I brought some photos to show you of another world, but this time is coming again soon, I hope. So this is some rehearsal photos. Those are always fun to see. So I'd now like to move back in time by about 100 years to talk about Leonora Duarte. On November 21st, 1640, the merchant and collector, Gaspar Duarte, wrote a letter to his friend, the poet and the diplomat, Constantine Huygens. Included at the end is a passage that is likely to pique the interest of the music historian. Gaspar writes, "We sometimes have a little music ensemble at home with 3 instruments, which are particularly suitable for 3 ladies, the spinet, the lute, and the viola bastarda, and me the 3rd treble on the violin, and for the voices, 1 lute and 1 viol for the trebles, with my 2 daughters singing." Another of Gaspar's letters to Huygens of a few months later, dated January 9th of 1641, contains this passage. "Sir, thank you for the 2 songs, the one in Italian and the one in French, the latter of which, though no air du coeur, is nice and good. In return, I'm sending you 2 other Italian songs, but I could not find the Oche Belle Guartieri." And indeed, a few months later, on April 21st of 1641, Gaspar penned another letter to Huygens about these songs, and it reads, "I'm sending you here 3 others in 2 parts in Italian that my daughters have been singing." All 3 of these citations provide fascinating details about the music-making practices of the Judeo-Portuguese Duarte family, converted Catholics or conversos in Antwerp, known today through the music that's left by Gaspar's oldest child, Leonora Duarte, whose 7 5-part sinfonia are the only surviving viol music written by a woman from the 17th century. Now, the letters from which I've just read are testimony to the music-making practices of Leonora and her siblings, to their father, and to Constantine Huygens, who's one of the most important figures in early modern diplomacy, and a businessman who, like Gaspar, had a hunger for high art. In the passages I've just cited, we read that their petit concert d'instruments comprised a lute, a spinet, and the polyphonic performance practice of viola bastarda. We read that Gaspar himself played the 3rd treble part on the violin, and that certain instruments were considered more suitable for 3 ladies. We also observe through these documents reference to a composer of airs that Gaspar admires, likely the singer Bernard de Varenne, who we know visited Huygens in Holland in January of 1640. The discussion of music in the letters offers a rare glimpse into the cultural and domestic life of a great artistic patron of the 17th century, and it positions the Duarte home in Antwerp as a creative hub for the convergence of the cultured elite. And incidentally, here's the family in a portrait by González Koch from the 1650s, and you can see Leonora pictured here in the center holding a guitar, sort of the centerpiece of her family. The correspondence, excuse me, is thus an important source document providing testimony of the sort prized by musicologists for its insight into music making in the domestic sphere. And in fact, passages such as these often take on a regular life of their own in the scholarly literature, where they persist in citations and in recitations separated from the original context of their letters. But what is striking is that the passages I've just cited appear in documents that are primarily concerned with business dealings. And thus they reveal that music helped facilitate what might have otherwise been complicated social and political transactions. One of the most crucial places where this music happened, as reported in the letters and in other testimony, was in the Duarte's Salon, which was a cultural and intellectual entrepot where trust and friendship were established across racial, linguistic, and also religious boundaries. The purchasing and the selling of wares were a shared concern of the merchant class, predominantly Jewish in the Low Countries. Business transactions were fostered in the home, where collections of art, instruments, and music could be viewed and heard extensively, allowing clients to linger. Gaspar grew his jewel business, his reputation as an expert in fine art, and his knowledge of music, all while serving as the consul to the Portuguese nation in Antwerp in the 1640s. The Portuguese nation functioned as a social embassy in which a sense of belonging was built on the shared experience of exile and of unity amongst persecution. Many merchants of Jewish extraction, like the Duartes, who had converted to Catholicism, yet some of them also remained steadfastly Jewish in identity and in practice. And it was for this reason that the Jewish Portuguese community, and especially recent converts, were considered suspect, a population marked as different. Unlike their non-Jewish counterparts, this threatened their ability to travel freely as citizens. However, despite the subordinate political position that Converso merchants held in Antwerp, or perhaps because of it, no other group provoked as much existential anxiety amongst non-Jewish merchants, simply by virtue of the fact that they were large in number and were persistent in their work and trade. Now, exile is a progenitor of social unification concerning Jewish histories as far back as the 15th century, and there are similarities between the Duarte's experience in post-Inquisition Antwerp and that of the Conversos, say, in Castile, following the Edict of Expulsion from Spain in 1492, when Conversos were collectively suspected of continuing to Judaize after their mass conversion. The Catholic Church closely monitored these converts who formed a group of their own, not part of either the Jewish or the Christian communities. These conversos were subjected to an ethnic anti-Semitism that was so intense that descendants of the converted bore the brunt of prejudice and anger for generations after. And I'm sure we can all agree that this sort of strikes a similarity to the history of African Americans in this country. The Duartes, too, were unified by a sense of exile within a community of other conversos, and this extended to their forging bonds with English royalists and English court musicians, such as Nicholas Lanier, who you see here, who was in exile himself in Antwerp during the English Civil War. The merchant class of which the Duarte were a part primarily comprised Jewish immigrants from Portugal and from Spain. Yet the Duartes exploited the exclusivity of their social religious community to subvert the notion of nationhood, at once challenging the position of the Converso merchant as a sort of wandering, nationless minority, and complicating a Gentile claim to national heritage. Their success bridged both worlds and was contingent on building and maintaining and embodying the family's image as cultural heirs to the literary and artistic traditions of Europe. In their case, not only in a bourgeois or even aspirational manner, but in really achieving a mastery over artistic practice with which they impressed, and it's fair to say, outshone their peers. The discursive uses of music in non-court and in non-professional contexts by conversos, alongside both the Jewish mercantile community and the Gentile elite, contributes to our understanding of the domestic values of culture in a population that was otherwise marginalized. Reading Duarte's and Hauchen's letters as business communication illuminates the Salon as a business space, permitting the Duartes to benefit from shared experiences predicated on the dissolution of social hierarchies. In 1648, Gaspar facilitated Hauchen's purchase of a Couchet harpsichord after an extensive correspondence with the Ruckers Couchet firm, one of his neighbors, incidentally, in Antwerp. Gaspar took a fond interest in instrument building, and he kept up with the developments of these makers. And some of these developments that Gaspar noted were crucial to the history of harpsichord making. Hauchen sent Gaspar in pursuit of a certain type of instrument for his collection, and in a letter from Gaspar of March 5th of 1648, received word that his friend had located a harpsichord with one full keyboard reaching to the lowest G. Likely speaking about the Couchet Model 2, a large single manual harpsichord, and you're looking at an example of one here, of a similar one here. The correspondence details an essential fact with regard to Couchet's instruments, that Couchet's single manual harpsichords usually had a range of 4 octaves from C with a short octave bass. And we know now that as late as 1644, Couchet's partner, Andreas Ruckers, is known to have been making single manual harpsichords, what we call the Couchet Model 2, with the range that's indicated in the correspondence with Gaspar Duarte. Gaspar's familiarity with the early days of the Ruckers Couchet firm and his expertise in the mechanics of the instrument likely are what encouraged Hauchen's to seek his counsel. Hauchen's purchase of the very sort of instrument that Gaspar procured is also therefore proof that he trusted his advice. Musical discussion with Hauchen's would also help to pave the way for one of the most significant business transactions the Duartes would complete in their long career, which was the London sale of a priceless brooch destined for Mary Stuart, daughter of Charles I, on the occasion of her marriage to Prince William of Orange in May of 1641. In their capacity as jewels in ordinary to King Charles I, Gaspar and his son, Leonora's brother, Diego, were the intermediaries between the English and Dutch courts as they negotiated the sale on behalf of Hauchen's employer, the stadtholder Frederick Henry, Prince of Orange. Prior to business discussion, Gaspar mentions, as part of the same letter, some unidentified French and Italian airs that he thought Hauchen's would enjoy, and we remember this correspondence from earlier. The sale was made, and the jewel was given to the 9-year-old bride. And as you can see here, it features very prominently in the portrait of the royal couple by Van Dyck from the same year, today in the Rijksmuseum. The exchanges of these letters surrounding this sale and others like it present us with an intriguing picture of material culture. And indeed, here the value of a luxury object is being established by 2 fashionable societies, that of the recipient and that of those making the sale. The Duartes, those making the sale, had arrived at the pinnacle of society at this juncture, despite the racial and even national prejudices against them. They were successful at business and at maintaining a genuine and consistent engagement with the arts, and they embodied the role of a successful bourgeois that came with it. As time passed, Gaspar's son, Diego, continued to cultivate an intimate musical connection with Huygens as well. In 1684, toward the end of his life, Diego sent Huygens some of his own compositions, seeking the diplomat's approval. A letter of Diego's to Huygens, dated January 9th of that year, explains the younger man's intentions to set a collection of psalms by Antoine Goudot from the Paraphrase des Psaumes de David of 1648. On January 6th of 1687, the year of Huygens' death, Diego writes another letter about this to his friend. The letter, as you can see, is greatly eaten away and it's missing quite a few words, but within its remains, we witness Diego telling Huygens that he has indeed dedicated his Goudot settings to the older man. Diego's psalms to Huygens are a paean to his father's close friend and colleague, a man who is a key figure in 17th century cultural diplomacy and whose connections had greatly sustained his family's business and ensured their ability to give full purpose to their cultural pursuits. Likely very influenced by the worldly man's own knowledge and fusion of musical language, Diego may have taken his own idea to set the Goudot from Huygens, as the older man had also set the psalms himself a few decades earlier. However, while Huygens, a Protestant, had used the Latin Catholic edition in his setting, Diego maintains the original French of the Goudot, a fact that suggests that Diego's works were intended for the bilingual elite of his and his sister's circle and meant to be performed in the home. Diego's letters about the works also reveal that he originally had doubts about setting the psalms and eventually decided that it would be appropriate to set them as long as, he writes, quote, praising God through song, end quote, was the sole intention. And incidentally, he didn't publish these works, and as far as we know, they're unfortunately lost. My dear colleague, Timothy de Pepe, in the Low Countries in Antwerp, in fact, who also works on the Duarte family, has cited a similarity between Diego's musical allegiance to Catholicism and to Leon Modina's defense of Salomone Rossi's intention to set the Song of Solomon 60 years earlier. Indeed, both composers contend that the purpose of the setting of psalms is indeed to praise God. Modena defended a newness in Rossi's music, however, perhaps what the historian David Rudderman calls, quote, a humanistic mobility, end quote, amongst communities of Jewish intellectuals of this time. Rossi's music was concerted music, and it arose in direct opposition to what Rossi and other like-minded commentators deemed the poor state of Hebrew song at the time. Rossi, of course, a Jewish composer. Diego might have felt compelled to defend his compositional decision on the heels of a jocular yet very telling comment made by Huygens' daughter, Susanna, in a letter expressing surprise that a Juif, a Jew, was writing psalm settings. Diego's defense of his own attempts at concerted music strikingly serves to distance himself from the stereotype of the Jew as a noisemaker, the creator of Jewish sounds emanating from the home, which was a major tenet behind the music libel against the Jews in the early modern period. The association of animalistic noise with Jews presents a complicated historiography in which Jewish cacophony, born of the synagogue, stands in relief against concerted Christian music. This topos, Ruth HaKohen has argued, is particularly embedded into the early modern period, and is a phenomenon that the musicologist Michael Morisson posits culminates in the 18th century. Morisson proposes, for example, that the aria "Thou shalt break them with a rod of iron" and the Hallelujah chorus, both of course from Handel's Messiah, are anti-Judaic in his words. He says, partially on the grounds that the people of Israel, whose destruction is celebrated in the Hallelujah chorus, are portrayed in "Thou shalt break them" with an evocation of noisy banter and confusion. Let's listen to the Handel "Thou shalt break them with a rod of iron" to see what Morisson means.
Thou shalt break them, thou shalt break them with a rod of iron. Thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Thou shalt break them. Thou shalt break them with a rod of iron. Thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel, like a potter's vessel. Thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel.
Amidst this soundscape, music may well have aided Diego's quest for social emancipation when he wrote to Huygens in a letter that music means harmony, contra noise, and does not tolerate contradictions. The musical socializing enacted in the Duarte Salon repudiates the anti-Semitic synagogal construct of domestic chatter and instead generates a secular domestic sense of embassy in which culture is economy. The Duarte's music making negates a construct of the Jewish home as a place of noise and heresy. And I'll now play for you, an example of Duarte's music. This is her Sinfonia number 4. It's in a nomine, and it's about 2 minutes long. On October 5th, 1641, Leonora is 31 years old. Moved after an evening spent listening to Leonora and her siblings perform at home, the English diarist John Evelyn recorded that, quote, "In the evening, I was invited to Senor Duarte's, a Portuguese by nation, an exceeding rich merchant, whose palace I found to be furnished like a prince's. His 3 daughters entertained us with rare music, vocal and instrumental, which was finished with a handsome collation." The term nation that Evelyn uses here is striking. Throughout his career, Gaspar maintained connections with Antwerp's Portuguese community, which primarily comprised other Jewish immigrants. The community was unified socially under the aegis of the Portuguese nation, which is a term derived from Portuguese word nação, and originally applied to groups of traveling merchants who had taken up lodging in another city. Embassies were also referred to as nations in the early modern period, such that nation is at once a concept, a unifying marker, and also a place of convergence. Many members of the so-called Portuguese nation, like the Duartes, were merchants who helped to grow Antwerp's economy substantially. Most of them were conversos who, whether crypto-Jewish or practicing Catholic, were restricted in one way or another from practicing in the guild system in any way, and thus from most trades and most crafts. Portuguese Jews in both Antwerp and also its neighboring city of Amsterdam attempted to build community in spite of this. In Amsterdam, where the Dutch Republic granted Jews religious freedom, community was formed in large part by importing Sephardic rabbis from Italy, from North Africa, from the Ottoman Empire, which forged connections to larger networks of Jews in the diaspora. Many leaders of the Amsterdam Portuguese Jewish community adopted Sephardic surnames as a means of sort of reclaiming their Sephardic, their Iberian legacy as emigres. Conversos in Antwerp who could not practice openly also discarded their Hebrew names in favor of Sephardic ones, including the Duartes, whose surname in Hebrew was Abole. Gaspar's success in this community of exiles culminated with his service as the consul of the Portuguese nation in Antwerp, first in 1641 and then again in 1646. Within this network, he's part of a mercantile community with a deep sense of belonging, in which heroic self-fashioning in exile in the wake of the Inquisition was crucial to a sense of belonging and to this next generation's sort of founding mythology. Gaspar's involvement in this network, even while he was cultivating business connections outside of it, entitled him to benefit from an additional community of members who were unified by shared experience of the past and the present and the desire to preserve heritage. And these connections proved crucial to the success of his business endeavors. Now, in some ways, Gaspar's community and network building resembled that of his religious cousin, Manuel Levi Duarte, a merchant who lived in Amsterdam, where it was acceptable to practice Judaism openly. Levi Duarte's professional success, like so many in his position, relied upon a very close network of other merchants of Portuguese extraction. His papers, which are now in the Amsterdam City Archive, are written mostly in Portuguese, and they reveal that the small Amsterdam Judeo-Portuguese community often conducted business between families. Manuel Levi Duarte's success was contingent upon his belonging to an ethnic minority living within a major trading city, connected by language, connected by kinship with similar communities than in other major cities. He's a test case that reveals how language, how religious identification and identity building amidst persecution bind and to some extent insulate and protect professional communities. Traveling internationally, yet maintaining a fixed linguistic identity, allowed Jewish merchants like him to connect with their so-called nations in foreign cities. And as such, these communities stood in for sites of both commercial and cross-cultural trade that created networks of trust, of shared identity, and of purpose. In spite of this, Levi Duarte was limited in his ability to engage in the artistic and in the musical small talk performed by the Antwerp Duartes. His letters make no mention of music, and his writings about art are constrained to business documentation, chronicling the collection of art that he would inherit from his Antwerp cousins. In Antwerp himself, from 1691 through 1696, to settle the Duarte estate following Diego's death, he fully documented his efforts to sell the 200-odd paintings. The following entry, in fact, which you can see here on the screen, is from his inventory. Lot 403 reads as follows, and you can see that he does not write out the names Jesus or Christ in keeping with religious Jewish practice. This is then in direct contrast with Gaspar and Diego's practice, their multilingual correspondence. For example, Diego's letter describing his decision to set all of Goudot's psalm paraphrases where God is spelled out in full. And while Levi Duarte had overlapping spheres of influence, they converged on the synagogue, a place that was at once the social and charitable focus of Levi Duarte's existence, where family and business and prayer congregated. Gaspar and Diego's an important and social and importantly musical capital allowed these two men to forge networks outside of the confines of the Judeo-Portuguese trade network. For the Antwerp Duartes, this convergence happened in the home. The ensembles that Gaspar and his daughters created, the music that they read and that they performed for guests, all served to suture the bonds that Gaspar and Diego built in their business world. At their home on Antwerp's fashionable Mire, music presented common ground for the Duartes and their stakeholders and granted them access to an international community of outsiders. It permitted them acceptable interactions with others, and it ultimately meant that their place in society extended beyond that of racial signification, which is truly remarkable in a climate when accusations of Judaizing could lead to death, as it had for the father of Levi Duarte's business partner, Theus, who was burned as a Marrano in an auto da fe in Cordoba as late as 1665. Music functioned for the Duartes as a means to legitimize relationships across these social, religious, national, and ethnic borders, much as it would in the Jewish salons of 19th century Berlin, spaces in which enlightened people peacefully coexisted, devoid of identity-driven segregation. Gaspar's interest in instruments, his musical banter with Huygens, his musically prodigious daughters, Leonora's music, which drew important travelers to the home, Diego's French settings of Goudot, and their multilingual letters all betray their deeply rooted investment in culture and in the business successes that grew out of such fertile soil. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weinfield. That was so good. And I just want to thank you on behalf of the Hispanic Society. That was a really, really interesting talk, and I definitely enjoyed hearing the music. You could hear it really, really well.
I'm so glad. Yes, our sound checks were worth it, weren't they?
So I do have a couple of questions that have actually been emailed in from our members.
Wonderful.
And the first one is, have you, during this time of research, been able to reflect on comparisons between Duarte's situation and the sort of current global political moment? And has it made you rethink any of, current artists, musicians who are working today, who are dealing with issues of social prejudice, of belonging, any ethnic minorities, this whole issue of the Converso, if this research has invigorated anything given the current time?
It's a very complex and very important question, or series of questions. First, I'll say that, interestingly enough, it's very likely that Duarte perished from the plague in 1678. We know that the plague decimated Antwerp around then. A few of her sisters as well, around the same year. So of course, there's this very tangible connection between her story and the current plague that we're all collectively fighting together. The second question is a bit more complicated, and it's worth remarking on, or maybe meditating on, the importance of minority voices, women's voices. Certainly, I would say from the time of the Me Too movement and forward now in our post-George Floyd world, those of us who are making music are thinking very seriously about minority voices. And what's interesting in particular about the work of women from the early modern period is that if we sort of look at the numbers and we count up the number of works we have that have been passed down to us by men, and we count up the number of works that have been passed down to us by women, we see that, of course, we have a great imbalance. We have so many works by men, not so many works by women. And for so long, that kind of numerical analysis was used as a legitimizing method to assess the state of music history. But we've learned a lot in the last 40, 30, 20 years, and we're currently assessing these questions again. Now, we won't ever change history. We can't change the fact that we know about X number of works by men and only Y number of works by women, but we can change the way that we look at that history. We can decide to look away from the numbers and to instead turn our focus to the spaces where, for example, women made music, like in the Salon, or in other similar places that weren't necessarily the court, and in Duarte's case, because she was Jewish, or Converso, but still ethnically considered a Jew in some sense. Certainly she couldn't compose for the synagogue as a woman, or of course, compose for the church, as so many male composers did in the early modern world. But when we look to the spaces that these figures inhabit and we focus on them, so much arises. And we can see that we can chart specifically feminized priorities within music history. We can chart specifically minority priorities within music history when we change our focus away from that kind of hierarchical assessment of music history.
Thank you. That's so true. And it's really a critical moment, I think, to be reassessing this right now and looking at these questions with fresh eyes. So I think that's wonderful. We have another question coming in about the words marango and converso. Do they mean the same thing?
It's a wonderful question. I'm so glad that someone posed that question. Now, marano is a word that I've decided to cut out from my scholarly work only when I'm quoting others, because it is a historical term. It means pig, and it's a term that was used to classify these communities of people who were Jews who'd been mass converted and who were suspected of continuing to practice Judaism. Converso, on the other hand, simply refers to a Jew who has been converted to Catholicism or who converted to Catholicism. It was done to them. Sometimes it was done of their own free will. Of course, every case is different. And we have to look back to history to see what the machinations were. Some wanted to convert, some were forced to convert, and so forth. So when we use the word converso, we refer to these populations of converted peoples who may have continued to practice Judaism in private, as we know many of them did. Sometimes we use the word crypto-Jew to refer to those populations. But the word marano, I would encourage us to only use as we're quoting history, but like other words in our in our environment, which have gone out of favor, I would say that we should put that one onto the shelf.
Definitely. Thank you. And we do have another question emailed in. And the question is about some of the prejudices that you had mentioned, this idea that Jews were associated with cacophony and loud noises. And the question is, do you know of any visual depictions of this sort of prejudice? You know, if there are any scenes that you're aware of that, you know, depict maybe a musical scene, but with this prejudice.
That's a fantastic question, and I would turn to my art historian colleagues to maybe develop more of an answer to it. There is a trope of synagogue pictures, of course, from the 17th century, published in Amsterdam, published in Antwerp, which were big centers of print publication. And there is certainly something of a sense of horror vacui with regards to the congregants, the busyness that evokes some of Charles Burney's writings. I mentioned Charles Burney earlier when I discussed Martinez. He's a wonderful, he provides very interesting testimony about Mariana Martinez. He also provides some pretty scathing and quite derogatory, and we could even safely say racist commentary about the Amsterdam synagogues, and hearing this kind of music and watching the kinds of gestures of sort of men davening and so on, to someone not used to that, would incite those kinds of remarks potentially. So it's a wonderful question, and I look forward to learning more about that, but I'm sure that it exists, and it's a very interesting point of comparison across the discipline of musicology and our sister discipline of art history.
Very true. And I think we have time for just this one last question, which is going to end on a sort of positive note, I hope. But someone is wondering if you have any plans to play live music in New York in the near future, if you have considered doing any outdoor events, or if that's something that if Sonnambula participates in anything like that.
It's a great question. Sonnambula is putting together a digital series. I hope you'll look at our website, www.sonnambula.org. But we are also potentially looking forward to some socially distanced in-person concerts. There's the possibility of something at our beloved Hispanic Society, but I'm not going to say anything about that yet because it's a surprise. Log onto our website, fill out the contact us form, keep in touch with us because we will let you know.
Perfect. I will leave your website in the comment section as well. So
that would be great.
Yes. Well, thank you so much again. This was really wonderful, and I'm definitely looking forward to doing this again soon. So thank you.
Thank you all so much. And to all of you listening out there, we miss you very much, and we look forward to performing for you soon. And thank you so much to the Hispanic Society for this wonderful program. And take care.
Have a good night.
Bye-bye.